What's up guys, welcome to today's video. Today we'll be covering the DOM API, the event target, nodes and elements on a web page. I hope you enjoy it. So what is the event target, nodes and elements on the DOM API? Well, essentially they are all components of the DOM. And if you don't know what the DOM is, you can go back to the first video in this series where I explain a high-level overview of the DOM. But to go into a little bit more detail, the event target is like the biggest object that owns most of the objects in the document object model. So nodes and elements are then children of that event target. And what I mean by that is that the event target has a lot of properties and methods on it, and the node inherits those, and also the element inherits the node and the event target's properties and methods. If this doesn't make sense now, don't worry, we'll do a few examples as we go on. But as long as you know that the event target is like the main player in the DOM that has a bunch of nodes in it and which also has a bunch of elements in that, and that properties and methods are inherited by each element as you go down into the object. So say for example you have a HTML document. Most likely your code will look something like this, where you structure it as by declaring a doc type of HTML and then adding all your markup inside there, usually two HTML tags, then the head tag, then the body tag in which your content goes. So this is how it will be rendered in your HTML itself. And then this on the right side would be the way that it is represented in your console if you log it out as a DOM tree view. So the entire document would be an object which has many objects inside of it. Some of these objects are methods, which means they have an effect, it's a function. The other objects are mostly properties on that object. So if, for instance, if we had to say that give me all the children of this document object, then we would say document.children, and that would give us the HTML tag because that is a child of the document. And if we say document.all, it would give us every single tag inside of this document. This entire thing is the document. So it will give us the HTML, it would give us the head, it would give us the title, give us the body, and this isn't how it is structured in the file itself, but it's useful so that you know what are all the tags on the page. The document.children is rendered the same way that your document is rendered. So if you have HTML, the head tag would be a child of that HTML, the title would be a child of the head tag. But body and head are siblings, not parents and children. So in this case, the children would be logged out HTML, and then inside the HTML it would be the body, and then inside the body would be the header. So we also have an easier way of accessing the body by saying document.body, and that's how you sort of, I'm assuming that you know how JavaScript works in this example. If you want to go onto a property in an object, you will say document.body, or if there's something inside the body, you'll go document.body dot something else, whatever is in that object. So to get back to the idea that these components inherit from each other in the DOM, let's look at the code a little bit closer. So if we target this header, if we have a look at this header item in our body, we'll see that it's a tag that in essence is an element, and it's a specific type of element. It's an HTML element. You also have SVG elements, but in this explanation and most of these examples, we'll just be looking at HTML elements, and I'll just refer to them as elements. So these elements, or specifically this header element, has a bunch of children, nav, ul, li, and these children have children, etc. But the header element itself inherits from node, which also inherits from event target. So this entire document, this HTML document, is an event target and a node as well, but it's not an element. The smaller parts inside the document are elements, and it inherits from the node, which is the big document, which inherits from a bigger parent, which is the event target. So in essence, the event target is the place where all these nodes and elements reside. It's not visually represented like that, but the event target supplies methods to the document and the element. If we look at the nodes and elements, you'll have a better visual representation of them, but event target is more of a conceptual idea. It is something that is inherited from the node and the element, and we'll have a deeper look at that soon. It doesn't mean that if event target or node or element has specific properties or methods, that node, or let's say if node has specific properties or elements, that element would inherit all of them. We want some of these properties and elements to stay on node, and we don't want to let element inherit it because it wouldn't make sense. Even if we look at the case of element itself, if we have HTML element versus SVG element, they are both elements that inherit from node, but SVG element and HTML element has its own properties and methods that it does not inherit. So to make this all a little bit more clear, let's look at an example. I'm going to bring up my console over here, and I'm going to create a directory called DOM elements nodes, and then I'm going to cd into that directory and open it in my code editor. I'm going to minimize that for now. So I'm going to start off by creating a index.html file, and we'll just use one file today instead of making and including many files. So this index.html file will represent our document, and by declaring this index.html and opening it in our browser, we are making a document object. So let's make it easy for the browser to identify what type of object it is. I mean document, it's an HTML document, and we have to give it our proper structure, the head, and let's just give it a title of, let's call this DOM elements and nodes. And then we'll create the body where all our content will go. And in this body, I'm just going to create a few random elements. I'm just going to paste them in. I have written them out beforehand so that I don't waste time writing all these redundant code, and save that. And the way we're going to start having a look at what the elements and nodes and how they work is that we're going to log everything out to the console from our file here. So we'll create the script tag where we'll write our JavaScript. So to go back to our slides, the thing we want to showcase is just how nodes are represented in the browser. To go back to the code, I'm gonna open up vscode again, and to get started, I'm just gonna write a few comments. So first of all, we want to see how the document node in the event target object in the DOM looks. So we won't write something like, because the event target isn't really a property that we access. We won't say event target dot document, etc. We actually need to say, let's just create this comment quickly. The actual place where the document resides is in the window, and we'll have a better description of the window soon, but the correct way of doing it is accessing the global object, which is the window, which is also an event target, but it's not a node. It's a event target it's a object of its own, and inside of the window we'll have the document. But because it's a global object, we don't really need to write window. We can just write document. To see the document in its the object structure, we'll write console.log document, and to make sure that it's represented as a object tree, we'll write console.dir, and that will give us the object tree representation. And just to show the element node, or the element on the page, which is also a node, we'll first have to select the element, and this selector is actually a method provided to us that is on the document object, and it's also inherited by the element object in the DOM. So the way we'll do that is we'll say document dot object, dot query selector, and this is just a way to select elements on a page. And we could say, so if you don't know how this method works, we could say query selector, and then in quotation marks we could say the element's name directly, like that, h1, and this will give us the first element. If we want all the h1s in an array, we have to say query selector all, but we'll say query selector h1, and this will find the first h1 element on the page. And this element is also a node because it inherits from the node class. And a few other ways we could select items. That's why I created these extra titles. We could say document dot get element by ID, and then just supply the ID special text. But I prefer always using query selector, because with query selector you could say document dot query selector and then just use your CSS selector. So you could say hashtag special text. And if you want to select classes, you could say query selector and then dot subtitle, and that will select the first subtitle. If we want query selector all, that will give us an array of all the subtitles. But that's just a quick background on how to select elements on a page so that we can access them. So let's just use the first one, document.query selector h1, and then let's assign that into a variable. We'll say const title node equals document.query selector h1, so that will find the first h1, and then we want to console.dir the title node, and then save that. I'm going to open this with live server. That's a extension on vscode. I'm just going to click go live, and we'll start a local machine. So now you can see that all those nodes have been added to the document object, and if I inspect this, I could have a look at the elements, and that's the exact markup that we wrote. This code is just put in here by live server. So if we have a look at the console now, we'll see that document object is logged out that we created in the code, the console.dir document. And if we have a look at the h1, it also has been logged out as a document object. So to quickly display the concept of inheritance, how the h1 element inherits from the document node, you'll see that the document has something. Let's check child nodes. So that is a node specific property. But if we look at the h1, it also has child nodes. So it inherited that property from document, and it inherits a lot more. So this concept of inheritance makes it much easier for us to write our own code. So if we look at the document, we can picture it as an object that has many objects inside of it, all these little nodes that have been created. If this is a little bit small, I'll increase the font size. Might be too big around there. But the element inherits the document's properties so that we can easily access these properties if we want to on all the nodes and elements. So now that we have a sort of high-level overview of how the document is a node that is an event target which has elements inside of it that allows us to access these elements and look at their properties and methods. Let's take a deeper look at event target, so the main object in the DOM. This object isn't really as tangible as the document node and element nodes, but it is still very useful and used all the time when writing DOM related code. the basic premise of the event target is that it allows objects to receive events and listen for events. So everything that is a child of the event target can subscribe to events that is emitted by other nodes in the event target, or they can send out events to the other nodes in the event target. So this allows us to create interactivity, and that's sort of the concept of when you click on a button, your content inside the text fields are being sent. So that's sort of like if there's a click on the button, then use this other element's content to send it to that place or something like that. It allows the elements and nodes on the page to communicate with each other. A visual representation of this would be that it is the event target is the main object, which is a parent of the node object, which is a parent of the element object. So the window and document, the document is sort of contained by the window, as I said earlier. And just to give you a visual representation of that, if we go to the console, just clear it out and say, let's just increase this, console.dear the window, you'll see that the document is actually a child of the window. If we can just find it in this maze. So there's the document. So the window is a event target of itself. It can also subscribe to events and listen to events of its children, but it's not really a node in the DOM. It's just an event target that contains a node called the document. So the window also has a lot of properties and methods on it, like the navigator, which is the browser. We can find out a lot about the navigator and its, you know, like, is it a Chrome browser? What's the window size? Is it loaded? Is it still busy loading? All those things we can get from the window object. So the document is contained inside the window, and inside the document, which is the node, we'll have elements like HTML tags, HTML elements, which also inherit from nodes. So they are also sort of nodes that are elements on the document, as discussed before. I'm not going to write this in the code editor. I'll just do this in the browser's console because that'll be sufficient. Just think about it that when we select items here or add event listeners or etc., we'll be looking at the elements on this page. Wait, let me go to the actual page that we created. On our little HTML document that we created, I'll open the console, just clear this out, and to illustrate the idea of events and how it works, we have to conceptualize it as the event target, which could be the window or the document or a node or an element, because all these objects inherit from event target. So conceptually, it would be something like event target dot add event listener. So this will create a event listener on the event target, but event target won't be the event target object itself. It would either be a node or element or the window or the document or your h1 or whatever, because all those things are event targets. So anything that is an event target, sort of like how the array has methods on it or how objects have methods on it, the nodes on the page also have methods inherited by the event target. So we'll start off with the window and we'll create an event listener. So there are some custom event listeners, you know, built-in event listeners that are provided by the browser. These events have been created for us to use as front-end developers or just to interact with the DOM. And they are things like click or scroll or change, any HTML event, and you can go search these on Mozilla Docs or Google or whatever. So we'll just listen for a click event, and this method has a callback function, the listener. So what is supposed to happen when we click on this, when we receive this click event? And what will happen is we'll receive a parameter or an argument sent by the event. And usually I just create this as E, but this, or let's just make it a bit more verbose and event. And then we'll just console.log the event for now to see what that is. Console.log the event. Let's enter that. Oh, too many brackets. So it will return undefined now because we just connected this event listener to the window. It doesn't return something immediately, but as soon as I click on any place on the window, it's gonna first of all disappear the console, but we'll see an event that is emitted. It's a mouse event, and this mouse event has its own properties and methods that we can use. So say we want to make an effect behind the mouse when we click, we could find the X and Y coordinates of the mouse and add a quick animation there or something to make it look cool, or we could find the element that's clicked on. And to show what was clicked on, we can do the same thing but do EventTarget. So if we click on the elements on the page, we'll see that the it actually kept both the events. So it keeps the first event that was created, and it also adds the second event that was created. So the target was the element node 5. We clicked on that. So I just moved the console down to the bottom of the window so that it doesn't keep disappearing. But if we click anywhere, we'll get the event that we listened to. So I'm just going to refresh the page, and these logs will come from our index.html, but now we shouldn't have those event listeners anymore because the page refreshed and it emptied out the memory. We could also be a little bit more specific with our event listeners. We did create a title node in our index.html. So on this title node, we can add an event listener, which is inherited from the event target. And we'll listen for the click event. And this time we'll alert clicked me. So this will make the click a little bit more specific. So if we click anywhere on the page, nothing will happen unless we click on the node, and then we get the alert that says click me. If we want to make sure that our click listener is specifically on one of the nodes on the page, we have to be very specific with which node we select. So that is a summary of the event target itself and how it sort of allows the nodes and elements on a page to add event listeners and listen to event listeners, etc. If you want to learn a little bit more about that, you can go to the Mozilla docs and look at stuff like custom events and creating new events that you name yourself, and then when something occurs, this event will launch. Remember that everything that I'm showing you here is just the theory or the baseline knowledge about what these things do and are, but where it really becomes important is the way you implement it. So you should go out and write some code, create an HTML page, style it with some CSS, and then use JavaScript with the DOM to change stuff. So use click listeners to move stuff or to look at properties or to invoke methods. And on that topic, let's jump into properties and methods on elements and nodes on the page. So the event target node and element, like, they all have their own properties and methods, but each of these properties and methods have important roles and use cases. So the element has a property called the HTML element has a property called inner text, where the node element has something called text content, but the HTML element inherits both of those properties. So there's different use cases for each of those. But this is where the beauty of inheritance comes in. We don't, or the browser or the DOM doesn't need to rewrite or assign properties and methods to each of the elements or nodes, because a lot of them are inherited. It only needs to care about like what is specific to an element, and those need to be developed specifically to that element. So let's look at a few use cases of this. So let's open up the console and we'll play around with the elements and nodes on the page. So this entire document object is the event target that's inside this whole window object. And inside this document object, we have elements that are also nodes on the page. So let's start off with some node specific properties. So let's start off with the document. So let's say document, and then we can look at the properties in here, and there's a few ones I want to specifically look at. We can look at let's look at document dot child nodes. So this will return a node list, which is almost like an array of all the child nodes in the document. And in this case, it's the doc type that we declared and the HTML. Because if you look at the code itself, you'll see that the entire document only really has two children. It has the doc type and the HTML that are direct children. The rest are children of the HTML or the head or the body. Then let's have a look at let's clear that out. And if you look at the HTML, you'll see it also has child nodes, which is the head, the text, and the body. So if we go to the body, which also has child nodes, which has all these child nodes, and it just goes on and on and on. And that's the beauty of inheritance. So all these things inherit the child nodes, and it's much easier for us to access these things and manipulate them on the page. So another cool thing about the node is it has a text content, which in this case is null, because there is no plain text inside of the document object. There are only nodes and elements. And then to look at the node text content thing, we can actually just use the title node and then write text content, and you'll see it's element node 1. So that is a node specific property. It's not a element specific property. We can also do something like title node dot next element sibling, which should return us the node 2, because that's next. And that allows us to look at the code and sort of, if we know we are on this element, but we don't really know what this is, we just know that there's something next to it, we can just do h1.next element sibling. And there's also something called previous element sibling, which will go back, but this one does not have a previous element sibling. And in that case, if there's no previous element sibling, it'll just say null. It won't give us an error or undefined or something like that. There are also methods on nodes. Some methods are node specific, or in this case I'm going to show you node specific methods. So we could say document dot body, which is an element but it's also a node, and then we could say append child, and then we need a node. So in this case we'll just reuse the title node that we've already created, and now you'll see that it's moved from the top to the bottom because we actually targeted that specific element node. And another cool method, so that we don't have to do that, is document, which is a node specific method. We could say create element h1. So let's save this into a constant new h1 equals document.create element h1, and then now we could say document dot append child, and then use the new h1 we created, and then enter. Oh, this is because the document already has, so if we look at the elements now, you'll see that in the body, in the document's only allowed to have the HTML. So we were supposed to say document dot, because our content resides in the body. So document dot body dot append child, and then that new h1 we created. So now if we go look at the elements, we won't see it here, but if we look at the elements, you'll see at the bottom, there's our newly created h1. So that's a few. There are many more methods that you could use on the document node, or any other node for that matter. But the document also inherits from the event target. So we could do document.add event listener if we want to, and that's the same that we did with the h1 or the title node earlier. And we can also do something like document, this is also a node specific property, method. We could say document.contains, and I think that it gives you an option, but now we have to sort of create that HTML. We have to find that HTML. So if we do contains title node and say enter, it'll say true, because we do have the title node somewhere in our document. If we say document.contains the new h1, say enter, also true. But if we say document, like earlier when we said HTML is not defined because we didn't store anything in that variable. So now let's have a look at some element specific properties in Node. So let's get an element out here. We'll just say title node, but we'll have to console.dir that. So this is the element, and here's some of its properties. So we've already looked at the node specific properties, like the first child or child nodes, and there's also the first child and all those node specific, but we also have element specific stuff. So we could say title node dot inner text, because that is a HTML element specific property, but we can't do that on a node because that's not an element. We could say something like title node dot class list, and we have no classes on this specific title node that we created, but we do have let's do let class element equal document dot query selector, and then we'll find the first class that matches, what did we call it? I think we called it, wait, let me just have a look at the code. We called it subtitle. So let's just do subtitle, proper English, and then say subtitle. Almost did it again. Save that, and now let's do class element dot class list. But in this case, class element is null because when we query selected our title, we never added our dot. So we should add our dot like our CSS selectors. Let's just do that without the let, because we're reassigning the variable. So now we have that subtitle. Let's clear this thing, and then we'll say class element dot class list, and now we have all the classes that are on the thing. So that would be useful if we want to apply specific styles or something to a HTML element. And we could also do something like, to do the styles dynamically, we could say dot style, and that returns a list of styles on this element itself. And we could say dot style dot color and then equals red. So now that subtitle goes red. So this is where the power of the DOM and JavaScript really comes in, where you can access properties and change their styles and positions and stuff like that. Now that we've looked at the properties on elements, let's have a look at some methods. The methods that it inherits would be something like title node, and then the obvious one would be query selector. So everything inside the title node, and then there's also stuff like remove, which is a node specific method. There's stuff like next sibling and all those that we've already looked at. But to show some of its own methods, we can say something like has attribute, and then this takes a string and let's say class. And no, this title node does not have a class. But if we say classed element dot has attribute, you'll see that it's true because it does have a class attribute. Another commonly used method on elements would be something like classed element dot class list, and class list itself is an object with a method, so we can do something like add and then just add something to the classes. So let's say new class, add that, and if we go to the elements, you'll see that this has now subtitle and new class. I would encourage you to take all of this information and just go to the documentation on Mozilla, because it's no developer really knows all of these things out of their head. If they do, they have a very good attention span and sort of a eidetic memory or something. But most of the time we use like 20% of these methods, and knowing how this works and how the DOM and the methods and stuff interact with each other, how the event target and the nodes and the elements inherit from each other, and why that's useful and how it works. This allows us to know more about what code, what happens when we write our code. So if we look at something like jQuery or vue.js or something like that, we don't just see it as a framework that we use where we write normal JavaScript or something like that. We understand what's going on under the hood. Something that jQuery does would be like element dot style, and then it would have something like add, and then we could say dot animate dot this dot whatever. It keeps adding stuff, and it makes it easier to write these queries and stuff. But it's cool to use those tools, but we really need to understand what happens when we use them, like what's going on under the hood. They basically are taking these built-in properties and methods and just encapsulating them or abstracting them into their own functions, which allows us more readable and a faster way of writing code. That's it for this video. It was quite a small deep dive, or an overview of the DOM and the event target and nodes and elements on the DOM, and showing some properties and methods that those have. But it by no means is a full example of the power of this, which I will demonstrate in the next and final video. By only using vanilla JavaScript, we could really, if we understand how these things work, we could really structure our code and manipulate our document in such a way that it creates beautiful UIs, or creates much more readable code for someone that maintains your code, or it just makes dynamic pages so much easier to write, and adding and removing elements and using APIs to render content so much easier. So this is more of a way to get you interested in reading further about the DOM. Go check out nodes and elements and stuff like that, and in the next video we'll actually build a website or some app or something with these principles, and using these methods and properties on elements, nodes, and event target, so that we can sort of create something beautiful. I hope you guys enjoyed this. If it was useful or you liked it just even a little bit, share it with someone or just give it a like, or subscribe to the channel if you haven't. But let me know what I can improve, what you guys liked, and yeah, stay tuned for the next episode. Thank you.